Somewhere over the steppes of eastern Ukraine, in the summer of 1943, a German pilot looked over his shoulder and saw nothing. That was his last mistake. What came next happened in under 3 seconds. A Soviet fighter, barely visible against the pale blue haze of altitude, dropped from above with surgical precision. No warning burst. No theatrical approach. Just a single, devastating pass. Round stitching across the fuselage before the German even had time to bank. The aircraft fell in a slow, lazy spiral, trailing a thread of black smoke that unwound all the way to the earth below. The pilot who fired that shot was not a veteran of Stalingrad. He had not flown over Moscow in the desperate days of 1941. He had not bled above Leningrad or dueled over the Black Sea. He was, by any standard measure of the war, a newcomer, a man who had spent 3 agonizing years watching other men go to war while he stood on the ground. But on that morning, in the sky above the Kursk salient, the waiting was finally over, and the world was about to learn the name Ivan Nikolaevich Kozhedub. To understand why this story is remarkable, you have to understand the war that was being fought above Soviet soil in those years, because it was not the war most people imagine. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the Soviet Air Force was all but annihilated in the opening hours. On the very first day of the invasion, the Luftwaffe destroyed approximately 1,200 Soviet aircraft, the majority of them while they were still sitting on the ground, neatly lined up on airfields as if waiting to be bombed. By the end of the first week, Soviet losses exceeded 4,000 planes. By the end of the first month, the number was staggering beyond comprehension. The Soviet Air Force, would have been one of the largest in the world on paper, had been reduced to a shadow of itself, its pilots inexperienced, its aircraft obsolete, its command structure shattered by Stalin's purges of the late 1930s. The Luftwaffe, in contrast, arrived over Soviet skies with pilots who had already spent 2 years at war. Men like Werner Mulders and Adolf Galland, who had honed their skills over Spain, over Poland, over France and England. They flew in flexible 2-man tactical formations called Rotten, later expanding into the famous swarm of 4 aircraft. They used altitude as a weapon. They attacked with the sun behind them. They understood viscerally and professionally that aerial combat was not about dogfighting in the old sense. It was about energy, position, and a single, overwhelming pass that ended before the enemy could react. Against this professional killing machine, young Soviet pilots were thrown into the sky by the hundreds, and they died by the hundreds. The average lifespan of a Soviet pilot in 1941 and 1942 was measured not in months, but in sorties. Some men flew their first combat mission and never came back. Some lasted 3 or 4 missions before a German cannon shell found them. The sky above the Eastern Front became a slaughterhouse, and the Soviet Air Force bled and bled until it began, slowly, agonizingly, to learn. By mid-1942, new aircraft were beginning to arrive. The Yakovlev Yak 1, the Lavochkin Lag 3, and later, the magnificent Lavochkin La-5, which would prove to be a genuine match for the German Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190. New tactics were being studied, often borrowed directly from captured Luftwaffe manuals and from hard, brutal experience. Soviet pilots were beginning to understand what their German counterparts had known since Spain, that survival required discipline, patience, and the ruthless exploitation of a single moment. But learning takes time, and time requires teachers. And so, across the vast network of Soviet aviation training schools that stretched from the Volga to Siberia, thousands of experienced pilots, or those deemed too valuable to lose in combat, were assigned to train the next generation, to take frightened young men from collective farms and factories and turn them into something that could meet the Luftwaffe on equal terms. It was a vital role, an indispensable role, and for one young pilot in particular, it was a role that was slowly destroying him from the inside. Ivan Kozhedub was born on June 8, 1920, in the small village of Obrazivka in the Sumy Oblast of Ukraine. He was by most accounts an unremarkable boy in unremarkable circumstances, the son of a modest Orthodox family, 5th of 7 children, raised on a diet of hard work and harder winters. There was nothing in his early life that would have predicted greatness. No aristocratic lineage, No special privilege, no natural-born magnetism that drew men to follow him. What he had was a hunger, not for food, though the Ukraine of his childhood had been scarred by the famine of 1932 and 1933, the Holodomor, which killed millions and left mark on every family in the region. The hunger Kozhedub carried was different. It was a hunger of a young man who would stare at the sky as a boy and felt something move in his chest when a biplane droned overhead. It was a hunger of someone who had read about Valery Chkalov, the Soviet barnstormer and test pilot who had become a national hero and had decided, quietly, privately, with absolute certainty, that he would fly. He joined a flying club at the Shaska Industrial Institute in 1938, learning on the Polikarpov U-2 biplane, the same sturdy, honest little aircraft that trainers across the Soviet Union used to give young men their first taste of flight. He was good, not extraordinarily so, not yet, but good. Steady hands, spatial awareness, a natural feel for the aircraft's rhythm, that almost unconscious sense of what a machine is about to do before it does it. In 1940, he was accepted into the Kozhedub Military Aviation School. By the time he graduated in 1941, the world had already changed beyond recognition. Germany had invaded. The war that would define his generation had begun without him. He was assigned as an instructor. Think about what that meant. Ivan Kozhedub, 21 years old, burning with a desire to prove himself, watching his country bleed, watching Soviet pilots die by the thousands over burning cities and contested rivers, and his duty, his assigned contribution to the survival of the Soviet Union, was to circle a dusty airfield in Siberia, correcting the stick technique of frightened teenagers. He applied for transfer to a combat unit. He was refused. He applied again, refused, and again, refused. The logic was brutally practical. Kozhedub was a gifted instructor. He could turn raw recruits into functional pilots in weeks rather than months. At a time when the Soviet Air Force was hemorrhaging trained men faster than it could replace them, a good instructor was worth more than another fighter pilot. The mathematics were cold and irrefutable. But the man living inside those mathematics was not cold. He was furious. He was desperate. He was, by some accounts, nearly broken by the humiliation of standing on the sidelines while others fought and died for a country he loved with ferocity that shocked even those who knew him well. He trained 354 pilots between 1941 and early 1943. 354 young men who flew away to the war while he stayed behind. He would later say that those years were harder to endure than any combat he experienced. That watching others go was a particular species of torture that left marks no enemy bullet ever matched. But the Soviet Air Force was not cruel without reason. And in the spring of 1943, as the strategic situation on the Eastern Front shifted towards something that might cautiously, guardedly, be called an opportunity, the calculus changed. The Battle of Kursk was coming, the largest armored engagement in the history of warfare. A confrontation between two massive forces along a salient of Soviet-held territory near the city of Kursk, with a front line bulged westward into German-controlled Ukraine like a clenched fist. Both sides knew it was coming. Both sides had been building toward it for months. And the Soviet Air Force, in the spring of 1943, was a fundamentally different organization than the shattered wreck of 1941. New aircraft, new tactics, new commanders, and an urgent, desperate need for pilots who could not just survive but dominate. Finally, the transfer order came through. Ivan Kozhedub, 22 years old and not yet fired a shot in anger at an enemy aircraft, was assigned to the 240th Fighter Aviation Regiment. He reported for duty in March 1943. He almost didn't survive his first mission. This is the part of the Kozhedub story that most popular accounts gloss over, because it doesn't fit the neat heroic narrative. The first time Ivan Kozhedub flew into combat, he came home having accomplished nothing. His aircraft shot up, and his confidence shaken to its foundations. The mission was a routine patrol. The regiment was flying Lavochkin La-5s, a mid-war Soviet fighter that had been designed in near-panic urgency in 1941 as a response to the FW-190's arrival over the Eastern Front. The La-5 was not a beautiful aircraft. It was wide, blunt-nosed, almost brutish, a radial engine machine that had been described by test pilots as handling like a truck compared to the elegant inline engine fighters of the Yakovlev line. But it was fast. At low and medium altitude, it was very fast. And in the right hands, it was lethal. Kozhedub's hands were not yet the right hands. Not because of skill, his basic flying ability was unquestioned, but because of experience. There's a kind of knowledge that only comes from combat, a situational awareness that no training can fully replicate, a bone-deep understanding of where to look, when to trust your instruments and when to trust your gut, how to read the behavior of an enemy aircraft from 2 kilometers away, and predict what it will do 30 seconds from now. He didn't have that knowledge yet, and on his first mission, he paid for the deficit. During patrol over the front lines, Kozhedub's formation was balanced by German fighters. In the chaos, the sudden, violent, three-dimensional chaos of an air battle, he lost sight of his leader, found himself alone, and then, almost simultaneously, took hits from 2 directions. One was a Messerschmitt Bf-109, which had gotten behind him. The other, and this is the detail that most histories mention with a kind of rueful understatement, was a Soviet anti-aircraft battery on the ground. Friendly fire, in the confusion and smoke of battle. Soviet gunners on the ground had opened up on what they believed was an enemy aircraft, and several rounds had punched through Kozhedub's La-5 before anyone realized a mistake. He made it back to his airfield. Barely. The aircraft was riddled. His hands, when he finally climbed out of the cockpit, were shaking, not from fear, or not only from fear, but from something harder to name. The accumulated tension of 3 years of waiting finally released into this. A first mission that ended in failure and confusion, shot by his own side, and not a single enemy aircraft to show for it. His commanding officer looked at the aircraft, then at the pilot. There was a moment, Kozhedub later recalled, where he was certain the verdict would be that he was not fit for combat duty, that he would be sent back to the training schools, back to the endless circles over dusty Siberian airfields, back to watching other men fight his war. Instead, his CO told him to sleep, eat, and fly again tomorrow. It was the most important sentence anyone ever said to Ivan Kozhedub. He flew again, and again, and again. In the weeks that followed his disastrous debut, Kozhedub embarked on what can only be described as a private war against his own inexperience. He studied everything. He interrogated veteran pilots in the regiment about German tactics, how the Luftwaffe pilots liked to attack, where they positioned themselves before diving, what the telltale signs were of an imminent bounce from above. He spent hours on the ground walking through maneuvers in his head, tracing his fingertips through the air like a man conducting an invisible orchestra. He listened to the older pilots talk in the evenings, absorbing their knowledge with the concentrated attention of someone who understood, with absolute clarity, that ignorance in his profession was not merely an academic failing. It was a death sentence. But Kozhedub was not just accumulating knowledge. He was refining a philosophy. The philosophy was this: altitude is life, and surprise is victory. The Luftwaffe had understood this since the Spanish Civil War. The great German ace Werner Mulders had codified it into doctrine. Always fight with the altitude advantage. Always attack from a position of surprise. Never get drawn into a slow-turning fight where energy is traded for nothing. Kozhedub studied these principles not as foreign doctrine to be imitated, but as fundamental physics to be internalized. A fighter that is higher than its enemy has potential energy, the ability to convert altitude into speed at the moment of attack. A pilot who attacks from the sun, from a blind spot, from an unexpected angle, is not a pilot who is merely flying well. He is a pilot who has already won the fight before the trigger is pulled. The La-5 suited this philosophy perfectly. At low and medium altitudes, the aircraft's Ash-82 radial engine, a massive 14-cylinder beast that produced 1,700 horsepower in its later variants, gave performance figures that surprised even German pilots who had been briefed on its specifications. It was faster in a dive than the Bf-109F, roughly equivalent in a level sprint to the Bf-109G, and its roll rate at low speeds was exceptional. Where it was weaker was in the climb. The Bf-109 could outclimb the La-5 in many regimes, and in high-altitude performance, where the thin air starved the radial engine. But Kozhedub wasn't planning to fight at high altitude. He was planning to fight on his own terms. By the summer of 1943, as the Wehrmacht and the Red Army massed their forces around the Kursk salient for the greatest tank battle in history, Ivan Kozhedub had transformed himself. He had gone from a confused, shaken newcomer who couldn't survive his first mission into something new, a pilot with a system, a methodology, an almost scientific approach to aerial killing that owed as much to patience and observation as it did to reflexes and bravery. He had not yet scored a kill. He had been in several engagements, had traded shots, had maneuvered and evaded. But the first definitive kill, the moment that transformed the fighter pilot from a participant in battles into a hunter, had not yet come. It was about to. July 6, 1943, the day before the Wehrmacht had launched Operation Citadel, the massive armored offensive that German commanders hoped would eliminate the Kursk salient, straighten the Eastern Front, and restore the strategic initiative that Germany had been slowly losing since Stalingrad. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein in the south and Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge in the north had assembled the most powerful armored force in the history of warfare. Over 780,000 men, approximately 2,800 tanks, including the new Panther and Tiger, and nearly 10,000 artillery pieces. Supporting them from above was the Luftwaffe, concentrating over 2,000 aircraft, Stukas, Heinkel's, Focke-Wulfs, and Messerschmitts in the greatest air armada the Eastern Front had ever seen. The Soviet response was equally overwhelming. The Red Army had known the offensive was coming. Intelligence from multiple sources, including the famous spy network known as Lucy, operating out of Switzerland, had given Soviet commanders detailed advance warning of German intentions. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had prepared accordingly. The Kursk salient was turned into the most heavily fortified position in the history of warfare. 8 separate defensive lines, 300,000 mines per kilometer in some sectors, 3,600 anti-tank guns, and over 1,300,000 soldiers. In the air, the Soviet Air Force deployed over 2,900 aircraft. And on the morning of July 5th, in what was perhaps the most audacious preemptive strike in Soviet aviation history, they launched a massive counterattack against Luftwaffe airfields before the German ground offensive had even begun. It was into this enormous, roaring, apocalyptic confrontation that Ivan Kozhedub flew on July 6, 1943. The sky over Kursk that morning was a different world from the relatively quiet sectors where Kozhedub had flown his first missions. This was not a patrol, not a localized skirmish. This was organized industrial slaughter at altitude. Formations of Soviet aircraft fighting formations of German aircraft while below them, stretching the horizon in every direction. The earth itself seemed to be burning. Columns of smoke rising from hundreds of wrecked tanks and vehicles. The continuous thunder of artillery audible even at 4,000 meters above the ground. Kozhedub was flying with his regiment when the German formation appeared. A group of Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, the iconic gull-wing dive bombers that have been the terror of infantry since Poland, escorted by a screen of Bf-109 fighters. The Stukas were targeting Soviet armor concentrations below, and they needed to be stopped. This was the moment Kozhedub had been waiting for. Not the specific scenario, not the specific aircraft, but the convergence of opportunity and preparation that every fighter pilot spends his career anticipating. He had the altitude advantage. He had the angle. He had the sun at his back. And, crucially, he had internalized 3 years' worth of lessons about what to do with these advantages. He didn't dive immediately. He watched. He identified a Stuka that had slightly separated from the others. Not dramatically, not recklessly, but enough. He calculated his attack angle, the deflection shot required, the moment when the target would be most vulnerable and his own aircraft would be most protected from the escorting fighters. Then he rolled and dove. The La-5 accelerated to the dive with a sound that pilots described as a mechanical howl, the engine roaring at full throttle as the airspeed indicator climbed past 500 kilometers per hour. The Stuka grew in his gun sight, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. Kozhedub held his fire. Held it. The instinct to shoot early, to hedge the bet, to release the tension. He suppressed it with an iron will. He opened fire at a range of approximately 30 meters. In aerial combat, that is almost point blank. At that range, a pilot is not aiming so much as gesturing. The 2 aircraft were so close that the cannon rounds from Kozhedub's La-5 had barely begun their trajectory before they struck. The Stuka disintegrated. Not dramatically, not with a cinematic fireball, though there was fire eventually, but with a sudden, almost clinical reality of structural failure at high speed. The aircraft simply came apart, shedding pieces of wing and fuselage and engine cowling as the energy of the impact was absorbed and dissipated into a cloud of debris. Kozhedub was already climbing again before the wreckage had time to fall. He looked down at his hands on the controls. They were steady. He had his first kill. What followed over the next 2 years was one of the most extraordinary individual performances in the history of aerial warfare. Not because Kozhedub was reckless, not because he took mad, suicidal risks or flew with the theatrical bravado of a man seeking glory. Quite the opposite. What made Kozhedub exceptional, what separated him from the many brave, skilled pilots who accumulated a few victories and then died, was precisely his refusal to be spectacular. He was systematic. He was patient. He was almost eerily calm. His kills accumulated with methodical regularity that unsettled even his regiment mates. 1 here, 2 there, then a day of 3. Each one following the same basic template. Height, surprise, proximity, decisive action. He never wasted ammunition. He never lingered over a kill to admire his work. He attacked, destroyed, and immediately repositioned to face whatever came next. By the end of the Kursk campaign, he had 6 confirmed kills and had been awarded his first Order of the Red Banner. By the end of 1943, the number had grown to 13. He flew the La-5FN, an improved variant of the base model that featured a direct fuel injection system, critical in a dogfight because it meant the engine wouldn't cut out under negative G-forces, a problem that had plagued the earlier version when pilots pushed the nose down suddenly. Small advantage. The kind of small advantage that, in enough situations, becomes the difference between coming home and not coming home. In early 1944, Kozhedub transitioned to the Lavochkin La-7. If the La-5 had been a capable fighter, the La-7 was something close to perfect. Engineers had stripped weight from the airframe, improved the engine cooling, relocated the oil cooler to reduce drag, and strengthened the structure to allow more aggressive maneuvering. The result was a machine that Soviet pilots and captured German pilots who were forced to fly evaluation examples considered genuinely superior to the Bf-109G and broadly equal to the Focke-Wulf 190A. Kozhedub flew his personal La-7 with serial number 27 painted on the fuselage. This aircraft had particular history. It had been funded in part by a donation from a beekeeper named Vasily Konyev, no relation to the Marshal, who had contributed his life savings to the Soviet Air Force Fund for new aircraft construction. The inscription on the fuselage read, "From Beekeeper Vasily Konyev." Kozhedub flew the aircraft with a particular sense of obligation. The trust of an ordinary citizen who had given everything he had for the war effort was, in some ways, a heavier weight than the expectations of his commanding officers. He carried it well. Through the winter of 1943 to 44 and the spring and summer of 1944, as the Red Army launched the massive offensive operations that would ultimately drive Germany from Soviet territory, Kozhedub's score continued to climb. 30 kills, 40, 45. He was by now a public figure, a hero of the Soviet Union. His first Gold Star had been awarded in February 1944, a name known to Soviet civilians through the carefully curated media of the wartime propaganda apparatus. But he wore his fame with a kind of puzzled discomfort. He was not, by temperament, a man who enjoyed being celebrated. He preferred the quiet of the cockpit to the noise of official functions, the clarity of a tactical problem to the murk of political obligation. And there was still work to do. The most extraordinary single moment of Kozhedub's career came on February 19, 1945. By this point, the war in Europe was approaching its final, convulsive months. The Red Army had crossed the Vistula, liberated Warsaw, and was driving westward toward Berlin. In the air, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its 1941 self. Starved of fuel, short of experienced pilots, flying increasingly obsolete aircraft against an Allied air armada that outnumbered it many times over. But Germany had one last card to play in the air, a card that, had circumstances been different, had it been introduced 18 months earlier, had there been fuel to fly it and pilots to fly it, might have changed the outcome of the air war entirely. The Messerschmitt Me 262. the world's first operational jet fighter. Think about what that sentence means. In 1945, every fighter in the air over Europe, Soviet, American, British, German, was powered by a piston engine driving a propeller. The technology was mature, the tactics were established, the performance envelope was understood. Pilots knew in their bones what an aircraft could and couldn't do. The Me-262 broke every rule. Powered by two Junkers Jumo 004 axial-flow jet engines, the Me-262 was capable of speeds approaching 870 kilometers per hour, roughly 150 kilometers per hour faster than any propeller-driven fighter in existence. Its four nose-mounted 30 million Malawian Quachas 108 cannon could shred a bomber in a single burst. Its rate of climb was extraordinary, and its shock value, the simple psychological impact of seeing a swept-wing aircraft accelerating away from pursuing Spitfire or Mustang, as if they were standing still, was enormous. Allied pilots had learned, painfully, that you couldn't catch a Me-262 in a chase. Your only chance was to intercept it at low speed, during takeoff or landing, when the jet engines were slow to spool up and the aircraft was momentarily vulnerable, or to somehow get above it and convert altitude into speed for a diving attack. Kozhedub didn't know that on February 19, 1945, he would encounter one. He was flying over Frankfurt and their Oder area with his wingman when the Me-262 appeared. It was flying a ground attack pass, a common and controversial deployment of the aircraft that Hitler had personally mandated against the protests of Luftwaffe commanders who wanted to use it purely as an interceptor. The jet was moving fast, very fast, too fast, by any conventional calculation, to intercept. Kozhedub, looking at the aircraft, made an immediate assessment that cut through the awe of the moment. The Me-262 was making a pass. That meant it was committed to a flight path. Committed meant predictable, and predictable, at any speed, offered a window. He pushed the throttle to its stop and dove. What Kozhedub did in the next few seconds was a masterpiece of applied physics, the kind of tactical thinking that cannot be taught in a classroom, but can only be achieved by a pilot who has internalized completely and instinctively the relationship between energy, geometry, and time. He didn't try to chase the jet. That was impossible. Instead, he calculated where the jet would be, based on its current heading and speed, and placed himself there first. He got ahead of the Me-262, cut it off, positioned himself at the apex of a deflection shot that required firing at a target moving at nearly 800 kilometers per hour, accounting for its speed and direction and the travel time of his own cannon rounds. He fired. The Me-262 staggered. Smoke poured from one engine. The pilot, realizing the impossible had just happened, that a propeller-driven fighter had somehow gotten a firing solution on the fastest aircraft in the sky, attempted to disengage. But the damage was done. The aircraft went down. Ivan Kozhedub, flying a piston-engine Lavochkin La-7, had shot down a jet fighter. He was the only Soviet pilot, and one of an extremely small number of Allied pilots in any air force ever to accomplish this feat. Word spread through the regiment within hours. Within days, it was being discussed in Soviet aviation circles with something approaching disbelief. The technical analysis alone was enough to astonish experienced pilots. The geometry of the shot, the precision required, the nerve of remaining in position long enough to fire effectively against a target moving so much faster than his own aircraft. But for Kozhedub, characteristically, there was no extended celebration. He filed his combat report, accepted the congratulations of his regiment, and went to bed. There were still more Germans in the sky. The final accounting of Ivan Kozhedub's wartime record is almost surreal in its completeness. 62 confirmed aerial victories, 62 German aircraft destroyed, each one a separate engagement, a separate life-or-death calculation, a separate test of skill and nerve, and the accumulated wisdom of a pilot who had spent 3 years learning the theory before the day he was finally allowed to practice it. Of these 62 kills, 17 with a formidable Focke-Wulf 190, considered by many German pilots to be the finest fighter produced by any nation in the war. For Heinkel, he 111 bombers. 2 were Junkers Ju-88s. 19 were various marks of the Bf 109, Germany's primary fighter from the opening day of the war to its last. 1 was a Me-262 jet. He flew 330 combat sorties. He engaged in 120 aerial battles. In all of this, in 62 kills, 330 missions, 120 aerial engagements, he was never once shot down. He was never once forced to bail out. He never lost a wingman under his direct protection. Think about that last detail for a moment. In a war where the average lifespan of a Soviet pilot in the early years was measured in sorties, Kozhedub not only survived but maintained an unblemished record of protecting the men who flew beside him. That is not luck. That is not even exceptional skill alone. That is a behavior of a pilot who understands that his responsibility extends beyond his own cockpit, who has internalized completely that the survival of the formation is as important as the destruction of the enemy. He was awarded the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times, a distinction so rare it is almost without parallel in Soviet military history. Each award represented a threshold of achievement that most pilots could never have imagined reaching once, let alone 3 times. He ended the war as a lieutenant colonel, having been promoted with a speed that reflected not political connection or family influence, but the simple, undeniable mathematics of his combat record. He was 24 years old. After the war, the story of Ivan Kozhedub continued, though in directions that were perhaps less cinematically obvious. He completed advanced military education, attended the Frunze Military Academy, and rose through the ranks of the Soviet Air Force during the Cold War to eventually reach the rank of Air Marshal, one of the highest positions in Soviet military aviation. He commanded air forces during the Korean War, though Soviet involvement in that conflict was, for political reasons, carefully concealed from public view at the time. It has since emerged that Soviet pilots, flying Chinese-marked MiG-15s, engaged American F-86 Sabres over the Yalu River, and that among the Soviet commanders overseeing these operations was Kozhedub himself. Whether he flew combat sorties in Korea remains a matter of historical debate, but his organizational influence on Soviet jet fighter tactics in that conflict appears to have been significant. He became a symbol, perhaps the symbol, of Soviet aviation achievement in the Second World War. His face appeared on postage stamps. Streets and squares were named for him. Schools in Ukraine and Russia bore his name. In the carefully constructed narrative of Soviet wartime heroism, Kozhedub occupied a unique position. A man whose record was so extraordinary, so empirically undeniable, that even the most ideologically rigid propaganda apparatus had no need to exaggerate it. The truth was enough, more than enough. He died on August 8, 1991, 2 weeks before the coup attempt that precipitated the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He was 71 years old. He had lived long enough to see jet aircraft make his La-7 a museum piece, to see the sound barrier broken, to see men walk on the moon, to see the country he had fought for begin its long, agonizing transformation into something different. He did not live to see that transformation complete, but his record lived and lives and will continue to live. 62 confirmed kills. Highest scoring Allied ace of the Second World War. A man who spent 3 years learning before he was allowed to fight, and then fought with a terrifying, systematic brilliance that left a permanent mark on the history of aerial combat. There's a question that hangs over the Kozhedub story, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Why did the waiting make him better? Because it clearly did. Kozhedub's 3 years as an instructor were not wasted years in any meaningful sense. They were years in which he analyzed combat reports, absorbed lessons from men who had been to the front and come back, thought deeply about tactics and physics and the nature of the aerial duel. When the moment finally came, when the 3 years of accumulated knowledge was finally given an outlet, the synthesis was extraordinary. He wasn't rusty or tentative. He was ready, terrifyingly ready. Ready in a way that perhaps only someone who has been made to wait is ever truly ready. There is something in that worth remembering, not just for military history, not just for students of aviation or the Second World War, but for anyone who has ever spent time watching others go forward while they stood still, anyone who has ever been told, explicitly or implicitly, that their moment hasn't come yet. Kozhedub's 3 years were not the preamble to his story. They were the story. They were the engine that drove everything that came after. The frustration, the patience, the obsessive study, the hunger that never dimmed. These were not obstacles to his greatness. They were its source. The sky over Kursk in the summer of 1943 saw many remarkable men, many brave men, many men who deserved to be remembered with the full weight of their sacrifice and their courage. But it saw only one Ivan Kozhedub, and by the time he was done, the sky itself seemed to know the difference. If the story of Ivan Kozhedub moved something in you, if the idea of a man who waited 3 years and then became the greatest of his generation made you feel something real, hit that like button, not as a mechanical gesture, but because every like tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to be seen. Stories that have been buried under decades of Cold War politics and nationalist mythology. Real people, real courage, real history. Subscribe to WWII Ghost Wings if you haven't already. We don't do filler here. We don't do recycle highlight reels. Every video we make is a deep dive into the people and moments that actually shaped the war, and by extension, the world you're living in right now. And here's the question I want you to answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know, do you think the 3 years of waiting made Kozhedub a better pilot than he would have been if he'd gone to the front in 1941? Or do you think those years cost him something irreplaceable? There's no right answer, and I've heard compelling arguments on both sides. Tell me what you think. The next video, I'll just say this. There was a unit in the Second World War that was told, clearly and officially, that their lives were worth less than other soldiers. That if they died, the loss would be considered acceptable. They were given the oldest aircraft, the worst equipment, and the most dangerous missions. They were expected to fail. They were expected to die. Instead, they compiled one of the most extraordinary combat records of the entire war and shamed an institution that had tried to erase them. That story is coming next, and I think it's one of the most important stories we will ever tell on this channel. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about these stories and the people inside them. This community is something worth building, and I'm grateful every single time that you choose to build it with us. We'll see you in the sky.